Jasmine, are you ready for me? I think we just, okay. Uh, Good afternoon to everybody who's here. We're really happy to see you. I'm Molefi Asante, and I'm professor and chair of the Department of Africology at Temple University. And our guest today is Dr. Melina Abdullah. We've been waiting for her. Unfortunately, she's had a time trying to get on. I'm going to introduce her, and hopefully she can get on by then. And if not, then we will talk about Sheikh Anta Diop.
Excuse me, Dr. Asante, she is on.
She is on. I knew she would be there. Thank you very much. Okay, Dr. Melina Abdullah is really one of these outstanding individuals who has made a legacy in her own time. She is professor and the former chair of the Department of Pan-African Studies at California State University, Los Angeles. And she earned her BA at Howard University. So I always say that, boy, Howard University is really glowing these days with the vice president as well. She earned her MA and her PhD from the University of Southern California, for which I will forgive her since I went to UCLA. But she is an incredibly wonderful intellectual. She was appointed to the Los Angeles County Human Relations Commission in 2014 and is a recognized expert on race, gender, class, and social movements. She is the author of numerous articles and book chapters with subjects ranging from political coalition building to womanist mothering. I like to think of her as we often say, she is one of the co-founders of the Los Angeles chapter of Black Lives Matter, and she has been one of the most articulate spokespersons for the movement. She's in all kinds of organizations. She's been a co-host and a co-producer of a weekly radio program. She has received awards from almost every institution you can think of. She's even received the Fannie Lou Hamer Award, which is one of the outstanding awards given by the Coalition of Mental Health Professionals. And she's also received the National Conference of Black Political Scientists Award, Sacred Sisters Award, California Teachers Association Award. Melina is originally from the great city of Oakland, California. And many times people think of her not just as a professor of Pan-African Studies, but also as an organizer, a hip hop scholar, a womanist, a truth teller, and a mama. And so we are just delighted and honored that she has given us the time today to speak with us. And Dr. Abdullah, welcome.
Thank you so much, Dr. Asante. It's really my honor and my privilege to be with you. And you know, you're one of my heroes and mentors, and one who, as I was an undergrad looking at what kind of scholar I want to be, you really emulated that for me and you were one of the inspirations in me going on to earn a PhD. And so I'm grateful to be here with you and grateful to be addressing you today. And I pray that the words that come through me are the right words. So I've prepared some slides, but I don't know how much I'm going to stick to the slides. What you asked me to talk about today was the tradition of scholar activism in Africana studies. And I think that that tradition, that truth, that foundation of who we are as scholars, but also as liberators and freedom fighters for our people is what attracted me to the discipline and what made me know that there's no other place I teach than through Black Studies. My department is actually the Department of Pan-African Studies, but the tradition is really what brought me in. So it wasn't, you know, an idea that I wanted to necessarily be in academia, but I saw Black Studies as what we call in my department, we've adopted the motto, we are the intellectual arm of the revolution. And I'm wondering if I can get co-host privileges so I can share my screen, because I do have a few slides.
Jasmine, can you make that happen?
Good.
Miss Belinda may have to, since she is the host.
Okay, Ms. Wilson, can you make that happen? Share, so she could share her screen.
Great. Oops.
Okay, yes, Melina.
Great, wonderful.
Thank you.
And I'm on the wrong thing. Hold on. Let's see if I can go to the beginning. So I just wanted to walk through some of just a few slides that get us to the core of what we mean when we say that we're the intellectual arm of the revolution. So I see it as the foundation and the tradition of Black studies or Pan-African studies or Africana studies, that we are scholar activists by design, by tradition, by the very core of our discipline is about Black liberation. And so I want us to remember the words of Jeremiah Wright, because I'm going to go back in order to go forward. In his book, The Sankofa Principle, he says, we cannot go forward without first going back to the past to understand how we got to where we are. Sankofa means that if we do not understand from whence we come, we will forever be headed in the wrong direction. And you all see the Sankofa bird, which is part of our tradition as African people, but also part of our tradition as Black studies, right? Recognizing that every struggle forward has to be constantly met by teachings of the past, or we'll be forever headed in the wrong direction. So I want to just kind of ask you to indulge me a little bit in going back to my past and how I wound up committing, but also being freed through Black studies. So as was mentioned, I am a child of Oakland, California. I was born in Oakland in the 1970s, but I say that still makes me 29, so don't let the math fool you. But I was raised, I was part of the Panther Cub generation, part of the children of the Black Power movement. And what that means is my generation was met with intense oppression by the state. So as I came of age in the late 80s and early 90s, crack cocaine hit my neighborhood really hard. There was an imposition of criminalization and mass incarceration that was beginning to take hold. But there was also a consciousness with which we were raised. And there were kind of counterbalances to each. And I didn't plan to talk about this, but I'm just going to insert this. Dr. Asante, I think you said I have 45 minutes, right? Is that right?
Sorry, I was muted. Yes, you had at least 45 minutes or more.
Okay, great. So I don't want to talk too much, but I will. That gives me time for just a very quick aside that I didn't plan to talk about, but I do want to include. I think it's important, which is that a lot of times when they talk about our communities, especially Black and impoverished communities, they talk about them in terms of our traumas, right? They talk about, I even began my conversation about how I was raised, talking about how crack cocaine had hit my neighborhood, and criminalization and police brutality hit my neighborhood. And those were all things that we were grappling with. And oftentimes we talk about what we had to overcome, but what we don't talk about is the tremendous tools that we had to fight back, to beat back those oppressions. And so my neighborhood, I was raised in East Oakland, California, in a neighborhood that we called Funktown, which if we were in Los Angeles, we would call a gang neighborhood. And, you know, a lot of folks talk about the traumas of those neighborhoods, and there were traumas in those neighborhoods. I witnessed my first murder between 6 and 7 years old, and there are countless dead bodies that I've seen in my lifetime. So those are traumas, right? I watched as especially the boys in my neighborhood were either imprisoned or killed. You know, I can't really talk about my upbringing without talking about he was really my second boyfriend, Curtis Belton, who was killed when I was 14 years old, and was the first funeral of someone I loved that I had to go to. And I still am sometimes visited by images of Curtis's face laying in that casket. So there are traumas that even as one who is not still 29 is sometimes, I'm sometimes moved to tears thinking about. But there's also tremendous beauty that's often neglected as we talk about those upbringings. So my neighborhood was also a place where there were 1 million children, and I don't even feel like that it was an exaggeration, right? They talk about our neighborhoods as being neighborhoods full of latchkey kids. Well, to me, that's something to celebrate. I remember walking to school in a pack of at least 30 children. And one of the things we would compete over is who had the best shoestring tied around our necks with the key on it, right? And I remember mine won often because it was a purple shoestring with unicorns on it, right? And I remember picking up children all the way to school, and we'd stop sometimes at the corner store and fill our bags full of Jolly Ranchers. And you know, you get popular for how many Jolly Ranchers were in your bag, right? Who had the best candy in their bag to sneak to each other at lunchtime. I remember playing tetherball. I don't think kids know how to play tetherball anymore. Getting your fingers stuck in the rope, right? I remember summers full of jumping over. We would go fence hopping and steal plums off of our neighbors' backyard trees. I remember my grandfather, who lived across the street, directly across the street, lifting up his garage door every summer and having Kool-Aid and snacks. He called the Kool-Aid Polypop because our family is from Louisiana and Texas, and that's what it's called there. Pitchers full of Polypop and snacks, and we would come in and learn a Bible verse and get some snacks, and then we'd have relay races and play Mother May I all summer long. And so our neighborhoods were full of beauty as well as trauma. And that beauty that comes from the core of who we are as African people, right? That beauty that comes from those transgenerational memories and that recognition and that Sankofa principle of looking back to move forward, remembering that it's the definition of family that extends beyond bloodlines that have got us through as African and Black people, right? That has to be, you know, enlisted as we beat back a state that is dead set on our murder. And so I want to remember the beauty of where we come from. And for me, as I came of age and there were these traumas in my neighborhood, I found a place of respite in Black studies. And you'll see on the screen a picture of one of my most honored and revered ancestors, Mr. Richard Navies, who was the founder and the chair of the Department of Black studies at Berkeley High School. So the neighborhood that I was raised in, Funktown, had a rival neighborhood called 69th Village, which was further east in East Oakland. And the way that the state does things is, even though I lived literally 10 blocks from Oakland High School, the children in my neighborhood had to go to Fremont High School, where the children in 69th Village also went. And so it caused all of this violence in the high school, so much so that there were so many shootings at that school during my senior year of high school that they actually ended the school year early. So I was blessed to have a mother who was an educator and a woman who was deeply, deeply rooted in Black tradition, who said that you don't have to abide by the rules that someone else sets for you. And so her godmother's sister, our family member, who we called Grandier, lived in Berkeley, California, one city over. And she had access to Berkeley High School. So the address that I began writing on all of my school materials beginning in junior high school was Grandier's address. And I would get up at 5 o'clock in the morning and I would take the bus for more than an hour to go to Willard Junior High School and Berkeley High School. At Berkeley High School, I was blessed to be a part of the only high school in the nation at the time with not just an Africana studies class or a Black studies class or a Black literature class or a Black history class, but an entire department of Black studies. So rather than taking regular English, we took Black Gold English. Rather than taking regular American history, we took African American history 1 and 2. Rather than having to take Spanish or French, we could take Swahili. And the children who attended Berkeley High School, our lives were transformed. We were reminded who we were as intellectual beings, right? We would walk into Mr. Navy's classroom and there wouldn't be a word uttered. Mr. Navy's would set the needle down on a record player. And I know some of you in attendance are going, what's that? But before there were CDs, before there were tapes, there were records. And Mr. Navy's had an old record player and he would put a record on the record player, drop the needle, and he would play Louis Armstrong and Miles Davis and Ella Fitzgerald. And he would say to us as we walked in, now write down your thoughts. And every day when we walked into his classroom, we would write down our thoughts. And on the last day of the week, we would share our thoughts. And sometimes our thoughts would be poems. Sometimes they'd be pieces of a play. Sometimes they'd be just gibberish. For Amir, who was in my class, his would always be a joke, right? But it was a way for us to celebrate who we were as beautiful, creative, intellectual Black children. And we would have in that class, every December, we would take a week where we didn't go to any other classes and we would take over the auditorium and we would have Back to Black Week, a celebration of Black culture. And every spring during May, during the week of Malcolm X's birthday, we would have Malcolm X Week. And it was a time to embrace who we were as Black people. And it really helped me become all of who I am. Now, Mr. Navy's, he planted seeds, but if you remember that Sankofa bird, if you remember how some of these eggs are inside the back of the bird, right? They haven't fully formed yet. In Mr. Navy's class, those eggs were being fertilized, but they hadn't been born, right? They hadn't been laid. And so I would drop out of high school and drop out of traditional school and kind of get into my own trouble. But eventually those seeds would take root, those eggs would be laid, and I would become kind of saved through a series of both traumas and beauties. I would go on and become an African American studies major at Howard University. And so I want us to understand what it was that I was exposed to as an early student of Black studies at Berkeley High School as one who became an African American Studies major at Howard University, I want us to know what I didn't fully know at the time, that Africana studies, Black studies, Pan-African studies, and ethnic studies more broadly is the only set of disciplines that was born out of community struggle, not out of an institution. And so I want us to think about things like the 10-point platform from the Black Panther Party, where point number 5 was, we want education for our people that exposes the true nature of the decadent American society. We want education that teaches us our true history and our role in present day society. I want us to think about what it means that they said that was part of, that was part of our platform, part of the platform in 1966. And then by 1968, we had this third world student strike, beginning with Black students at San Francisco State College, now San Francisco State University, part of the California State University system in which I teach, where students said that we are not going to submit to an oppressive model of education. We are going to demand a liberatory model of education. It wasn't just the students, it was also radical faculty. You know, we have to think about the role that people like Sonia Sanchez, people like Amiri Baraka, so many others played in birthing ethnic studies. We also have to think about the role that community members played, members of the Black Panther Party, but also regular mothers and grandmothers who once populated San Francisco. I know you think that there's no other Black people, no Black people ever lived in San Francisco because they can't afford it now. But in the 1960s, San Francisco actually had a rich and vibrant Black population, right? So we had places like Hunters Point and Sunnyside. We had places like the Fillmore that had very strong and rich Black communities that were part of making these demands in 1968. And so for 4.5 months in 1968, students at San Francisco State University shut down that institution and said that we are not going to submit to these oppressive conditions. We are going to demand Black studies. And you saw similar uprisings happen at places like Cornell and other institutions all across the country where they demanded Black studies. So again, Black studies is, excuse me for a moment, Black studies is the only discipline, or ethnic studies is the only set of disciplines that, again, comes from community demand rather than an institution. And so recognizing that, our scholars in ethnic studies scholars, as well as ethnic studies students and practitioners, have had to be activists, have always been activists, have never been a part of academia, have been intellectuals, but not academics. If we think about the distinction that's drawn by people like Bell Hooks, who says that, you know, we should be honing our intellectual tools in the institution, but we shouldn't see ourselves as part of the institution. So I want to say that that is foundational to who we are. It's foundational to what we are. It is true to our tradition to be that. And if we are anything less, we're actually betraying and belying what Black studies is. And so if we fast forward by 50 years, right? If we fast forward from what was happening between 1965 and 1968 to what took shape in 2013, right? If we think about, you know, movement moments, if we think about the birth of Black studies, the birth of Black power, and the work that was being done in the streets and on campuses in the 1960s, as well as what, and compared it and put it side by side, juxtaposed it to what's happening now, what's happening between the 2010s and the 2020s, right? we see some parallels. So I don't think it's coincidental that when we talk about Black Lives Matter as a Black freedom movement moment, it's not coincidental that when we talk about Black Lives Matter, we have to recognize that Black Lives Matter was founded out of the tradition of Black studies. So to be clear, Black Lives Matter was founded on July 13th, 2013. That's the day that George Zimmerman was acquitted in the murder of Trayvon Martin. And that's the day that many of our cities in Los Angeles, in Philadelphia, in Miami, in New York, all across the country, our cities exploded, our cities erupted, and we engaged in what Brenda Stevenson calls intuitive organizing. That's when we take to the streets. We might not have a plan, but we let intuition and spirit lead us. And so for many of us in Los Angeles, we went to a place that nobody has to call us to. It's called Lamert Park. It's where the Black community goes anytime anything of significance happens. And so on the evening of July 13th, 2013, some of you all will remember this moment. We had been glued to our television sets watching the trial of George Zimmerman. And of course, Trayvon Martin was not the first child to be killed at the hands of white supremacy and an anti-Black state. He wasn't the first one whose life would be stolen by someone who wanted to be police, but actually wasn't, right? And I think it was perhaps the not so true part of Zimmerman's life that made us think that maybe he'd be held to account. So Zimmerman had appointed himself as a neighborhood watchman. The neighborhood watch didn't even actually want him, right? He made himself a police officer in his own mind. He actually wasn't police. And so I think many of us thought, well, maybe he won't get all of the privileges that the state has to offer because he's not really part of their institutions, right? He wasn't even really white. His mother was Peruvian. And so I think a lot of us who had witnessed what happened to Sean Bell and Amadou Diallo and Oscar Grant and all of those injustices were thinking that maybe there'd be some semblance of justice for Trayvon Martin and George Zimmerman would be convicted. But of course, on July 13th, 2013, we heard the words that he was getting off and the court was giving him his gun back. And so we erupted and we poured out into the streets. And I remember hearing those words and having to do what women like Joanne Robinson had to do when she heard of the arrest of Rosa Parks. Not that I'm in any way, I'm in no way worthy of being uttered in the same sentence as Joanne Robinson, but I feel some of what I believe that she must have felt, right? As a Black mother professor, hearing about the arrest of Rosa Parks while she was grocery shopping, doing family errands. That's the same thing that happened to me. I was doing family errands and my brother called me and told me what happened. And I remember gathering my children up and going home and still having to cook for them and feed them and bathe them and find someone to sit with them, and then calling over several other Black mamas, and we called ourselves the Mama Brigade. And I remember pouring out into the streets with them, but also recognizing that I was a mama to more than my biological children, that the children or the young people that I had the privilege of calling students were also my spirit children. And so I sent out texts to a bunch of my spirit children, and they met me in the streets, and for 3 days, we engaged in intuitive organizing. But on the third day of our protest, and of course we weren't there by ourselves, we met thousands and thousands of other folks who were also in the streets. On the third day of our protest, as we shut down the freeway, the 10 freeway, which we think is the first freeway shutdown of the Black Lives Matter movement, I received a text from Patrisse Cullors, who's one of the 3 co-founders of Black Lives Matter. Patrisse had been in conversation with Alicia Garza, who I didn't know at the time, but was dear friends with Patrisse and is now my dear friends, and also comes from the Africana Studies tradition, having recently earned her master's in Africana Studies at San Francisco State. They had been in conversation, and Alicia had penned what she called a love letter to Black people, and she signed that love letter, which was posted on Facebook, Black Lives Matter. And then Patrisse, who had been in Black organizing space, we had convened a Black organizers coalition and had been doing work together for a few years. The organizer that she is, she called together the organizers that she knew. And some of those organizers were professors of Pan-African studies. Myself and a dear comrade and colleague and sister, Stacy Mitchell, were both in that group, as were about 15 of our students. And we gathered together in the middle of the night in Patrisse's Black artist community. It was called St. Elmo Village. Who you see on the right is those students. Out of that initial convening, we pledged to build a movement, not a moment, a movement, not a moment. And so in a span of just 2 days, we planned the first march of the Black Lives Matter era, which was a march in Beverly Hills. Early on, in fact, the first day of protest, we had adopted a principle that we would disrupt spaces of white affluence and build in spaces of Black community. So the first planned march that we did was actually in Beverly Hills, and that's the mall that's featured in that film, Pretty Woman, that we're disrupting. You'll see a bunch of us at the bottom of the stairs, and then Charlia Gully, who was one of my students who was a track star, is running ahead of us because she's a track star. And we were disrupting that mall. We built Black Lives Matter intentionally. We built Black Lives Matter in a way, again, that sought to disrupt white supremacist, patriarchal, heteronormative capitalism and build Black community, recapture the things that are beautiful from our ancient selves, from our traditional selves, and fight back against oppressive systems that we see as being vestiges of chattel slavery. So things like police, prisons, and jails had to be upended as we visioned and built towards a world of liberation. And so the first statement that we developed as Black Lives Matter is this: Black Lives Matter is working for a world where Black lives are no longer systematically and intentionally targeted for demise. We believe, as is written in by Manning Marable, that the systems under which we live are intentionally and deliberately designed to produce the outcomes that they do. And so they have to be upended. We can't tinker around the edges of policing or mass incarceration. We have to end those systems, because it would be ridiculous to say that we're going to tinker around the edges of chattel slavery. These are vestiges of chattel slavery, and they were deliberately and intentionally built for the outcomes that they produce. And so they have to be upended, right? We continued that we affirm our contributions to the society, our humanity, and our resilience in the face of deadly oppression. We've put our sweat, equity, and love for Black people into creating a political project, political as in power, right? Taking the hashtag off of social media and into the streets. So to be clear, when people say Black Lives Matter is a social media movement, no, we use social media as a tool, but we understand that you cannot upend systems and create new ones just by engaging online. The call for Black Lives to Matter is a rallying cry for all Black lives striving for liberation. I know that some folks were saying that we were pleading with the system to recognize us. That's never been the truth. This has never been a plea. It's been a recognition of our own power. And it's deeply, deeply rooted in who we are as Black studies and as Black intellectuals. So we then went on to join with other organizations that are part of this moment in Black liberation struggle. And we organized under the umbrella of the movement for Black lives. We developed a vision for Black lives, which includes to end the war on Black people, reparations, divest from police and prisons, invest in the things that actually make us safe, invest in economic justice, community control. We want to be autonomous beings, right? And then building political power, not just in the sense of government, but in the sense of real power over our destinies. Excuse me for 1 minute. We saw with Black Lives Matter, as we were building in the streets, also a tremendous movement take shape on campuses. Remember the initial members of Black Lives Matter and who continues to engage in Black Lives Matter, the movement for Black freedom in this period is Black students, largely from Black studies departments. And so when we saw what was happening in neighborhoods and communities also take shape on campuses. So especially in 2015 and 2016, we saw Black students rise up and demand freedoms on our campuses as well. What we saw, however, is as the pandemic hit, institutions kind of take advantage of the recognition that students are no longer on campus to make demands, to kind of roll back some of our progress. And so we saw that happen on campuses, and we've also seen that begin to happen in communities. Until May 25th, 2020, and leading up to that moment, during the pandemic, we saw Black people disproportionately hit by COVID-19. We began to make demands. In Los Angeles, we issued something called the Black LA demands, recognizing that the system was attempting to double down on its white supremacist roots. And so in the midst of an unprecedented global health pandemic, with an unprecedented economic fallout, the system was attempting to push funds and resources into policing and jails. The Black LA demands and the Black Oakland demands and the Black Sacramento demands were designed to say, no, we need resources to go into things like housing and mental health care and education and technology, not into police. And they attempted to ignore us. But as the state stole the life of Ahmaud Arbery, people began to rise up. As we witnessed Breonna Taylor's life be stolen in her bed while she was sleeping, the world rose up. And then when George Floyd was murdered for 8 minutes and 46 seconds, with Derek Chauvin absolutely summoning the evil of his forebearers, refusing to hear the cries of George Floyd, who said, "I can't breathe," the world couldn't look away, and the world cracked wide open. The world cracked wide open, and we saw a very early renaissance of the Black Lives Matter movement, where people poured out into the streets by the hundreds and thousands and hundreds of thousands and millions worldwide. And Black Lives Matter has now been measured as the largest racial and social justice movement in global history. The picture that you see on the right is of one day of protest in Los Angeles. This was June 7th of 2020 when we took over Hollywood. And there were over 100,000 people in the streets demanding justice in the name of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and Breonna Taylor, but also in the names of Waukesha Wilson and Kenny Watkins and so many others whose lives had been stolen by police right here in Los Angeles. You started to hear the chant, defund the police, which Barack Obama thought he would call a snappy slogan, but what we call a policy demand. We demand the defunding of the police because by defunding the police, we can move towards abolition. We coupled that call for abolition with a reimagining of public safety. And so as I was talking with you about my neighborhood, we remember that in my neighborhood, police came to brutalize and harass us, but who came to keep us safe was my grandfather and my grandmother who kept their garage door open, was my mother who would teach children to read on our front porch every single day after she got off work as an elementary school teacher. Who kept us safe was Miss Rose, who would sit on her front porch all day and would make sure that if we got into trouble, she would snatch you up a little bit and then tell your mother so that she could snatch you up when she got home. So that's who kept us safe. And when we think about reimagining public safety, it means that Sankofa moment. It means going back to the village and remembering that we have all that we need to keep us safe, that we keep us safe. It means remembering that in places like Newark, New Jersey, mayors like Raz Baraka are saying, you know what, we can defund the police somewhat, and we can begin to invest in community-driven solutions to public safety. It means that people like mayors like Chokwe Lumumba are saying that we know that the state and the federal government are absolutely trying to poison and taint our water in the blackest city in this country, Jackson, Mississippi. But we in Jackson, Mississippi have been growing our own food, have been building people's like organizations like Cooperation Jackson. We in Jackson, Mississippi have been building, our own educational systems, and we in Jackson will get clean water for our people. And so it means recognizing that we have solutions and we want to invest in those solutions. It also means that we recognize who our enemies are, and it means toppling those enemies. It means refusing to pretend as if we live in a state of peace when we're really at war. Those are the words of Dr. Maulana Karenga. Refuse to live in a state of peace when we are really at war. And I'll say when they've declared war upon us. We need to remember that as we talk about policing descending from slave catching, who organizes police and allows them and enables them to behave as slave catchers, are police associations that disguise themselves as unions. And so we've said that we are not going to submit to their war upon us. We're going to fight back, and we're going to end police associations. It also means reimagining what our educational system looks like. And I'll start first with our K through 12 system and what this moment that the world has cracked wide open means to our young people. All over the country, we've been chanting defund the police, and very few places have been successful in actually doing it. In Los Angeles, we celebrated a bit when it was announced that $150 million was being cut from LAPD and reinvested into Black community. That accounted for the very same rate of increase that LAPD was slated to get that year, right? So it really wasn't a defunding of police. It represented less than 10% of the police budget, of the public police budget, right? But the children say, you know what, we want to defund our police altogether, because if there's one place police don't belong, it's on our campuses. And so they have been shutting down school board meetings. They have been speaking before school board. They developed their own plan of action, which includes not only the defunding of police, but the removal of police from their campuses completely, the ending of random searches of our children, and the demand for ethnic studies in their schools. And they won all of those things, all of those things. They got their school police defunded, not by 5%, not by 10%, but by 35%. And there are no longer police allowed on the campuses of LA Unified School Districts. They also won ethnic studies. We had won an ethnic studies requirement a few years ago, but they won ethnic studies as being implemented in an authentic manner on their high school campuses. And they won a community schools model, which is true to the African tradition of allowing for places of learning that extend beyond the formal education of a school system. And so this is what they've won. I want to say what it could mean for us as people who find ourselves in academic institutions, but not of them. At Cal State LA, as we moved into this moment, we made demands of our institution. And we try to be true to what it means to a world being cracked wide open. Number one, what we want of our institutions is a defunding of the police and a reimagining of campus safety. So a removal of police from our campuses. We want a university system where student admissions are open to anyone who wants to attend, and students are empowered when they're on our campus. Oops. I'm missing one. And then finally, we want authentic ethnic studies. Authentic ethnic studies. What that means is an ethnic studies that's grounded in the scholar activist tradition that says that, you know, we don't want just diversity, equity, and inclusion. We want a Black Studies department and a Black Studies praxis that is engaged in liberation work outside of and beyond our campus. And so those are the things that we're struggling for. Here's how you can be a part of it. You can use your voice. You can share your truths and push back. We're encouraging you all as intellectuals within the revolution to write articles, to influence your own circles, to think about the social media that you want to follow. People like Greg Carr, people like Anthony Ratcliffe. You're welcome to follow me. I couldn't find Dr. Asante's Twitter handle, but if he has one, I'd love to hear what it is so I can include that as well. We want you to show up in the body. What that means is we want you to major in African American studies, Africana studies, Black studies, Pan-African studies. We want you to vote with your feet by taking our classes. We want you to attend department events, and we want you to declare yourself the intellectual arm of the revolution. And then finally, we want you to create requirements. It shouldn't just be students who are in our majors and minors taking our classes, right? We want to make sure that all students are required to take ethnic studies at both the K through 12 and university levels. And we want to utilize university resources to advance our discipline, but also to empower our communities. And with that, I'll pause, I'll stop my screen share, stop my share, and I'm happy to engage in any conversation that we can have from here.
Thank you very much. This was a very powerful presentation. And, you know, at some points, I was in great joy. And at some points I had tears in my eyes. You gave a profoundly provocative discussion of the activist tradition and also educated us. And you just, you know, we want to say this to you, Dr. Abdullah. You're a great monument to our struggle, to our people, to the nation. And we appreciate you for being with the Temple community. Jasmine, do you have any questions or were there any comments?
Yes, we actually do have a few questions. Before we do get into the questions though, Dr. Abdullah, I just want to say thank you so much for your lecture. I definitely enjoyed it. My undergrad, I come from Kent State University, where our Department of Pan-African Studies was formed because Black students got up and walked off campus. And so just standing on that legacy, I definitely enjoyed your lecture. So thank you for that. Let's go ahead and get into the questions. Again, if you do have a question, please use the question and answer feature, and we will be able to ask them and get them answered. The first one comes from Christopher Murray, who says, I've always envisioned Black studies programs and HBCUs as the centers in the community that work to solve problems within the Black community, as well as providing that intellectual foundation. But that hasn't always happened. What can Black studies programs and HBCUs do to really make this happen?
Sure. So first, I want to say thank you to Dr. Asante. Your words mean everything, and your encouragement means everything. And Jasmine, that is a huge tradition that you come from, as well as beyond you being another department of Pan-African Studies. So I'll always have an attachment because it's another department of Pan-African Studies along with the University of Louisville, right? Which is also Pan-African Studies, but also your history in the creation of Black History Month at Kent State, right?
Yes,
so what Black students did at Kent State to say, nah, and I always laugh because they called it a Black History Month, but I think you actually went from January 3rd to the end of February for your Black History Month. So your students, what was that, 1969, right?
1968 or 1969, yes.
Right. Took 2 months and said, forget Negro History Week, we're taking Black History Months, right?
Exactly.
And so you come from a very rich tradition. The question that was asked about HBCUs, as a graduate of an HBCU and an African American Studies department at an HBCU, I remember my first year at Howard questioning whether I needed to be an African American Studies major. And this is why. I think that the way that we teach, so remember, Africana Studies, Black Studies, Pan-African Studies is not just about subject matter, it's also about the way we teach our pedagogy and the why we engage in the research that we do, right? And I think that both that subject, the pedagogy, and the epistemology are practiced at HBCUs, at least at mine, across disciplines. And so I found myself in my Spanish class at Howard. My professor was Ian Smart. And I remember learning about how Spanish, his theory was that Spanish was actually an African language, because from the, I can't remember the years. I hope Professor Smart doesn't ever see this, but between a certain period of time, Spain didn't have an official language. And they didn't get an official language until Moorish rule. So his theory was that the Moors were actually the speakers of Spanish, and what made Spanish the official language of Spain, so that Spanish was actually an African language. And he was also a linguist and gave other kind of examples, right? I remember walking into my math class, and I'm not the greatest at math. And I remember my math professor teaching about how math comes from Kemet and the Kemetic roots of everything that we were doing. And I'm saying that not because I remember every single thing from my undergraduate experience, but that in every single department at Howard University, there was kind of a foundation that was common to the Black studies tradition. And if you think about where the first departments of Black studies and Pan-African studies and Africana studies were born, they were at predominantly white institutions. And I think that's because there was a stronger pushback against more oppressive educational models. Now, that's not to say that HBCUs are doing everything right and they don't need Africana studies departments or African American studies departments. It's to say that there are a greater number of legs on the table, right? It's not just Africana studies that is giving us our truths or our ways of learning or ways of kind of understanding and engaging the world. And so I think that it's going to take more intention in building those departments at HBCUs to make them stronger and larger, because there are people, including students and including faculty outside of the departments, who think that we can also rely or recognize that we can also rely on departments that are not Black studies or Africana studies. So I think it's going to take more intentional investment, intentional recruitment, intentional work to recognize that we can have a strong Department of Political Science that's grounded in Blackness. We can have a strong Department of History that's grounded in Black history. We can have a math department that teaches about the Kemetic roots of math, but we also need a strong Africana Studies, Black Studies, Pan-African Studies department to kind of be the center of it all. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. Our next question comes from an anonymous attendee. They say, do you feel like you or others need to push back sometimes within the college infrastructure or faculty with their comments or existing rules that are harmful to Black students? How do you navigate that while maintaining the expectations of being quote unquote professional?
I don't try to be quote unquote professional. So yes, all the time, we have to remember that these institutions are not ours. These are not ours, and we are not theirs, right? We are not theirs. We belong to our community. We belong to our people. We do not belong to the institutions in which we find ourselves. And so Wade Nobles often talks about freshwater fish having to live in salt water, right? And we are freshwater fish living in salt water. Every institution is literally designed to eat us up, okay, to make us bleed, right? Think about what happens to freshwater fish in salt water, right? I think that the way in which that we can survive in salt water is to surround ourselves with other freshwater fish, right? To make sure that we swim as schools, that we build our own as best we can within these institutions. And this is why Black Studies departments, this is why BSUs, this is why Black faculty and staff caucuses, this is why, you know, every piece that we can build within those institutions is vital to our survival. This is why we also must disrupt that line between the campus and community, right? One of the things that started to happen as Black Lives Matter began to take root is I found myself targeted. And I'm gonna just offer a quick story. I hope that's okay. I used to be, you know, institutions like to have favorite Negroes, right? They like to have the Black folks that they trot out at the dinner table. If you talk about universities, they like to have the one Black person. Hang on, I gotta grab my charging cord. They like to trot out their Black faculty member that they can show off to their donors, that can be their speaker on their panel where they realize at the last minute they didn't have anybody Black, right? I was that person. So I was the one that was invited to their dinner tables. I was the person who was invited to speak. I was the person who was trotted out at press conferences. I was that person until Black Lives Matter. And what Black Lives Matter did is remind them and remind me that I don't belong to that institution and that I cannot be trying to seek what Dr. Karenga calls a comfortable place in oppression. And that happened as a result of Black Lives Matter, which also was happening as we began to struggle for an ethnic studies requirement on our campus. So as I was turning up in the streets, I also was challenged to turn up on campus. And so I saw all of the, well, not all but the most genuine of the comrades turn against me, to stop inviting me to their dinner parties. And I had to become okay with that. I had to remember that I'm here for my students and my people and my community, and I'm not here to say, you know, it was.
That's right.
When we started struggling for this ethnic studies requirement, there were a few of us who were engaged, but every single Black faculty member suffered. Every Black faculty member was voted off of every single committee in the entire university the year after we started struggling for the ethnic studies requirement. And so, you know, those are consequences that we have to bear. It's not a valid struggle if there's no consequence, right? We have to be willing to suffer consequences. Now, I believe in drawing lines. So one of the things that I say my line is if it in any way jeopardizes the safety of my children, right? I can't.
I think there's a buffering problem, Jasmine.
Yes, it may be her internet connection.
Okay.
She
so
should be coming back.
Well, we have about one more question, okay?
Okay.
We have one more question. If she comes back on. If not, and while she's buffering, let me just say that boy, this is an incredibly wonderful talk, because we've had the same issues at all institutions. I know at Temple, for example, we see ourselves as being in the vanguard of the discipline and doing many things, but always there would be pushbacks against the efforts on the part of African people to express agency. The institution is not set up to accommodate or to support or to aggressively support the interest of African American people or African people. And so I truly understand what Dr. Abdullah is saying and what she has said to us today, because Michael Tillotson is correct when he says that always you have agency reduction formations forming when African American people want to advance. We have had difficulty. I've been at Temple for nearly 40 years, and we have never had a time in which we have had, maybe initially, maybe for the first 3 or 4 years of my being at Temple, where we had an aggressive administration that came from the president, the vice president, the provost, and the dean. Did we have a really aggressive push to make Temple #1 in the nation in terms of scholarship in African American studies. But since that time, we've always had difficulty. And we've had difficulty because people do not want Black people to express any interest in support of Black people or in support of Black interests. If it's in support of Black interests, then you can guarantee there will be agency reduction formations. If you say we need to do this and we need to move here, they will say you can't do that. And of course, we have to always remember that much like I always say about Sheikh Anta Diop and about Francis Cress Welsing or Du Bois, that your desire has to be the liberation of African people and African minds and the advancement of truth and knowledge, and not a desire for accolades from people who certainly do not appreciate the fact that the origin of the human race is on the continent of Africa, and the origin of civilization is on the continent of Africa, and that African American people will fight forever for liberation and will not be under oppression. So I understand the Kent experience, the San Francisco State experience, the Howard experience, and exactly what Professor Abdullah has told us today about the experience of ethnic studies in California. I will say this, is she back on?
No.
No. All right. I will say this, that last week, I was on a program with the State Board of Education in California. And the State Board of Education in California has just adopted the most progressive ethnic studies curriculum in the country. 77% of all the children in the schools, public schools in California, 77% are non-white. And not only that, but the children who are Samoan, the children who are Korean, Vietnamese, as well as, of course, all the other ethnic communities that we know of, all had an opportunity to create a robust curriculum. And that robust curriculum, which I had a part in creating, was adopted last week. So it's a state that does have there are a lot of difficulties, but at least they're advancing the nation. And I think that we have to at least adopt some of the principles that they are adopting in the state of California. Shirley Weber, who is the Secretary of State in California, was my master's student at UCLA when I taught at UCLA. And Shirley is one of the people who is also responsible for getting African American studies, Latinx studies, Native American studies, Asian American studies adopted at California as a part of the curriculum, so that students have to take ethnic studies in California. Happy to see you back. Dr. Abdullah, I was just telling them about Shirley Weber, who was my student. She got a master's with me at UCLA, and Shirley Weber is the Secretary of State. And she was also the Assemblywoman who worked very hard to get the ethnic studies requirement for the state of California in the higher education. Yeah.
Yeah, so
you can say your last comments. Thank you.
So the passage of AB 1460, and I'm still trying to figure out what happened to my computer and why it went out, but I can't. So we're going to have to, I guess I'll just have to be on the phone. So the passage of AB 1460 was a really long and hard fight. And I didn't realize that Dr. Weber was your student, but it makes sense. Dr. Weber was tremendous in this fight for AB 1460. What happened was we are in a constant state of always trying to figure out how to maintain ethnic studies. And I don't know if people didn't do their research or what they were thinking, but they had gone after the Black Studies Department at Long Beach State, where Dr. Karenga was chair. And if I were them, that's not, and I wanted to undo Black Studies, that's not the department that I would have started with, but that's the department that they started with. And so we were engaged in a fight to maintain Black Studies and ethnic studies in the CSU. And what was clear is the CSU didn't want to maintain ethnic studies. They wanted to declare war on us. And so basically we said, we're going to have to go over their heads. And so we did. And we sought legislation, and Shirley Weber drafted that legislation. And what we saw was, wait, I think my computer's working now. What we saw is the drafting of AB 1460. It actually went, oh no, it's not working. It was, we were fighting for it for 2 years. So the first year that it was introduced, it actually did not develop. But the second year we engaged in the fight, and we did win AB 1460. It was a long, long fight to get it passed. We were up against the chancellor. We were up against the academic senate. We were up against a lot of folks who organized themselves against ethnic studies. But in the end, we did what we do. We engaged community, we engaged students, and the students and the people and the community won the passage of AB 1460 over many, many hurdles. We're still in a fight to try to get implementation in an authentic way, but we are very grateful to all of those who engaged, including our disciplinary association, the National Council for Black Studies, which was one of the first organizations to write a letter in support of the ethnic studies requirement. And so that passed in 2020, and we're working on implementation now.
Well, thank you very much. And Jasmine, I think that is probably the last question, the last comment. We just want to thank again Dr. Abdullah for her presentation. And we're going to just try to make her a part of our department every year, come and give us this inspiration. But we want to thank you very much, and thank all of those of you who've come. And Jasmine, we could probably get a recording to her, get a copy of. Okay, thank you very much. Okay, well, thank you all for everybody. Go ahead, Jasmine, you can close out.
Yeah, just a quick announcement. This lecture was already live streamed to our YouTube page, so it's already there, and we'll make sure we'll send it.
Very good. Thank you.
Thank you all so much for having me. I feel really honored to be with you and grateful to be with you.
You are wonderful and fantastic. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.